Each generation of Americans must define what it means to be an American.
There's even a major book on the subject called Generations.
To understand the personalities of today's living generations, you really have to go back and look at their life cycle.
Its co-author, Neil Howe, argues that we're not just looking here at two generations, the old and the young, but at four age groups, each vying with the others for economic and political power. The oldest of these is the GI generation, the 25 million living Americans born between 1901 and 1924. This is the generation that fought in World War II, the heroes of Iwo Jima and the beaches of D-Day. John Kennedy was one.
The torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans born in this century.
6 GI generation presidents followed: Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, and Bush.
After the war, they just went on building. The cornucopia of post-war American prosperity, the Pax Americana of peace, interstates, moonshots.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The GI generation has had a uniquely close attachment to governmental activity. Many GIs, senior citizens today, look at the federal government like a buddy that's grown up along with them. It's paid special attention to their life cycle at every phase that every phase of life that they've occupied.
Next in line is the so-called silent generation, the organization men of the 50s and 60s, perhaps less confident than the GIs. These are the 40 million living Americans born between 1925 and 1942. This is the generation that became adult during the boom years of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Theirs is a rags to riches story, from comparatively poor Depression-era childhoods to unprecedented affluence. The silent generation experienced the fastest income growth and the greatest accumulated wealth than any generation before or since. The silent generation is followed by the famous boomers, Bill Clinton's generation of 69 million Americans born between 1943 and 1960. These are the children of the GI generation, the generation of rock and roll and Woodstock and sexual freedom. But above all, the boomers are the generation that fought or avoided fighting the Vietnam War. The effort to avoid the draft for some may have been a stronger generational bond than service in the war itself was for others.
The boomers are a generation of trends, from the early wave boomers born in the mid-40s to the late wave boomers born in the late 50s. One of those trends is greatly diminished success in the marketplace, in their own standard of living, in their ability to afford a home, in their coverage by health insurance, pension participation, net assets of their household, on and on down the line. Late wave boomers have done much worse than early wave boomers.
Last comes the 13th generation, the 80 million young Americans born between 1961 and 1981. This is the MTV generation, the generation of lead or leave.
The debt is rising $1 billion a day. What happens when the bills come due? America's red ink is killing us.
These are the poorest Americans since the Depression. The generation of McJobs, jobs that pay the minimum wage. But why 13ers? What does the name imply?
We call them the 13th generation because they are the 13th generation in succession since the first U.S. generation, the peers of Sam Adams and Benjamin Franklin. We also use the number 13 because it conjures up some of the bad luck and ill timing of their life cycle.
Anita's generation in the boom years after World War II had very different economic expectations than Maria's generation does today. It took Anita's generation just 30 years to double its standard of living, whereas Maria's generation won't see that doubling in their lifetimes. On present trends, it will take an incredible 240 years to double theirs.